It's really my great pleasure to introduce our final session on networks, collaboration, and community, which I think and hope will connect a lot of the themes that have come out throughout the last 3 days of this conference. To lead us in this discussion is Dr. William Noel, who is the director of the Kislak Center for Special Collections, Rare Books, and Manuscripts, and the director of the Schoenberg Institute for Manuscript Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. Until September 2012, he was curator of manuscripts and rare books at the Walters Art Museum in Baltimore, a position he took up in 1997. He received his PhD in 1993 from Cambridge University in England. He is the author and editor of several books, including the Harley Salter, Cambridge University Press, 1995, and the Utrecht Psalter in Medieval Art, Picturing the Psalms of David from London, 1996. Will directed an international program to conserve, image, and study the Archimedes palimpsest, the unique source for 3 treatises by the ancient Greek mathematician. A popular account of the project, the Archimedes Codex, which he co-wrote with Riviel Netz in 2007, won the Newman Prize and was published in 27 languages. Will has helped to orchestrate many grant-funded digital initiatives, including the digitization of the illuminated manuscripts of the Walters Art Museum, again in Baltimore, and the medieval manuscripts in Philadelphia's Special Collections libraries. He is an advocate for good quality collections of open data, and in 2013, he was honored as a White House Open Science Champion of Change. He's on the faculty of Rare Book School, University of Virginia, and he is an adjunct professor in the Department of History of Art at the University of Pennsylvania, and he is a TED speaker and O'Reilly FOO camp veteran and vice chair of the Philadelphia Consortium for Special Collection Libraries. Please join me in welcoming Dr. William Noel.
Thank you very much, Adriana, for that introduction and for a wonderful, wonderful conference. And welcome back to the future, everybody. Panel 6, Networks, Collaboration, and Community. I'm going to introduce the speakers as they speak. And our first speaker is Rachael Dreyer. She's the head of research services for the Eberly Family Special Collections Library at Pennsylvania State University's University Park campus, a position she has held since 2015. She worked previously as a reference archivist at the University of Wyoming's American Heritage Center, and perhaps it was there that she became a kombucha aficionado. As an active member of the Society of American Archivists, her professional interests include increasing access to special collections and archives, creating user-focused archival service points, and building more diverse and inclusive archival holdings. She's speaking today on Frontiers for Special Collections Libraries. Rachael.
Good morning, and thank you for that introduction, Dr. Noel, and also for the wonderful conversations we've been having over the past 3 days. I'm here to welcome you to Refworld, a future where public service points help maintain the relevance of the Special Collections Library in an evolving research environment. Public service points are the central terminal, a point of arrival and departure for all the research that takes place in the special collections environment. Whether research takes place in person or online, it must all route through a public service point. For the purpose of this paper, I've taken a broad interpretation of public services. For some, public service in the library environment relates strictly to reference work. However, I've expanded this definition to include instruction and outreach as well, because these are also how special collections interact with and attract researchers. As so much instruction leads to research, and research leads to teaching and learning with our collections, I'm not sure that these components can be considered separately. One point I hope to emphasize today is the need to place public services in the center of any discussion for special collections' future. Without public service points, there is no access to these collections. And that is what makes special collections so special, the ability to touch and engage with these materials. And now a word about those rare and unique materials. Many of our larger research libraries have begun to seem very similar to one another, what with large journal packages and consortial arrangements for access, as well as interlibrary loan. Regarding circulating in electronic collections, what I can access at my home institution looks a lot like what I can access at another. But rare and unique materials held in special collections are difficult to duplicate. The collections represent an individualized collecting policy that reflects the research needs and interests of its stakeholders in the university environment. Collection strengths reflect historical priorities and depict institutional history. Each special collections is truly unique in what it can offer the teaching and learning community, and this presents opportunities for outreach, for collaboration, for the research experience. And it is through those opportunities for teaching, learning, discovery, and research that special collections holdings demonstrate their value. Items that are difficult to obtain carry certain monetary valuations. However, the cost of an item is not the only measure of value. The most important measure of value in a special collections or archives is use. There are other benefits to consider when discussing rare and unique collections. They benefit different audiences in different ways. And we sometimes take these benefits for granted when we think about why it matters if something is rare and unique. For researchers, rare and unique collections represent an opportunity to engage in singular scholarly activity. For special collections librarians, these rare and unique materials represent specialized expertise in these particular subject areas that they are able to share with researchers through a collaborative research process. For institutions, rare and unique materials represent the unique support they contribute to the growth and development of human knowledge. So we've already established that special collections have amazing opportunities for research. We have our rare and unique materials. What are we going to do with them? How are we going to recruit new user communities? Well, for one, special collections and archives professionals need to engage in collaborative partnerships as active participants, not passive members, as our public library colleagues emphasized yesterday. We're capable of pulling our weight as active partners. Though our unique collections draw researchers to us, we also need to assume an active role in recruiting researchers and instructors as collaborators. As digital scholarship becomes just scholarship, we need to update our instructional toolkit as the process of research changes. We must also gain expertise with current and developing data analysis techniques being used for digital scholarship. We should be aware of how our collections are being applied to research so that we can contribute as equal partners on research endeavors. We can also pursue different instruction models, such as embedding into semester-long courses, teaching semester-long courses, or teaching brief intensives on emerging research tools. This, of course, means we must be proficient with these tools and techniques, a good incentive to gain expertise. We can embrace these technologies with a spirit of experimentation. Our former rare books curator had a 3D replica made of our Sumerian tablet so it could be handled during instruction sessions, something that was not possible with the original. And also 3D printed game pieces to invite engagement with a special collections exhibit. Other ways to expand our knowledge base would be to collaborate on a course where students learn about the history of the book and then must 3D print a component of the book. Makerspaces can also serve an outreach purpose as well, teaching a bookbinding course, for example. Critical practices in archives and special collections libraries have impacted collection development in visible ways, encouraging institutions to re-examine traditional collecting practices and to actively seek materials from underrepresented communities and donors who contribute to a more inclusive and representative historical legacy. Critical practices allow special collections to explore alternate approaches to collection building that provide more open and transparent collecting practices. For example, unhitching ownership from access and description opens the door to collaborative collecting with new and diverse donors if we embrace a wider adoption of post-custodial arrangements for archival collections. It's freeing to think about the ways to make archives accessible without taking physical ownership of them. Digital surrogates offer a lot of potential to see this collecting strategy succeed. However, though we can offer access without ownership, we need to avoid collecting and curation decisions where we take ownership but do not provide access. What does it mean to involve our end users more actively in collection development decisions? Usually in a special collections library, acquisitions are guided by collecting policies, curators, internal committees, and subject selectors, often a combination of these. However, unless they have curatorial or acquisitions duties, those who work most directly with end users aren't involved in collection building. Yet public service professionals enjoy the most opportunity for casual conversations with researchers. These conversations can be informative for both researchers and special collections librarians. How do we harness the valuable data communicated during these interactions? We need to create spaces for conversations with researchers and the reference team about how their projects might inform collecting efforts. Perhaps we perform a brief exit interview as part of the reference interaction, or place a suggestion box with recommendation cards for researchers to submit, or even a web form for users to suggest areas in which we need to enrich our holdings. Many of us work with faculty members who make suggestions for new acquisitions based on the semester's syllabus or their teaching and research interests. We could formalize and adapt this practice so that all researchers have equal ability to influence collecting efforts and to contribute to inclusive, representative collection building. I've talked a lot about special collections and archives in the abstract, and now it's time to bring it back to the concrete physicality of the space itself. I'll introduce our space as an example. This is the view from the reference desk. And many of our spaces still look the same as they did when the buildings were first constructed, aside from the addition of copiers and scanners. If we don't update our physical spaces to support the modern research environment, we run the risk of alienating researchers and rendering our collections useless. Perhaps we survey our spaces to see what small changes we can make. Maybe we remove the reference desk entirely or introduce a roving reference model. And we definitely install adequate electrical outlets for our researchers' devices. There's also a critical need to expand our definition of physical accessibility and how we provide service to all in our spaces, but I will save that for a separate discussion. As we update our physical spaces, we also need to think about the services offered. Access to rare, unique, and archival collections has changed over time, and we have seen heightened expectations regarding electronic access to collections. Even now, most of our collections are analog, and we continue to collect paper-based materials, even as we acquire more born digital formats. We see an increase in requests for digital surrogates, in addition to requests for information about collections that may be described only enough to pique someone's interest. As we put more content online, this research audience continues to grow. At the same time, we have limited physical space with which to engage on-site researchers, and we have a small staff who triage these many different research interactions. We will always provide access and use for analog collections, but are we coming out of our shell to the extent that we need to be as we explore different strategies to engage with researchers? Because of the centrality of our public service points, those in public-facing roles are uniquely situated to establish partnerships with various special collections stakeholders, to understand the effects of digitization, and to feel the disappointment of researchers when the inclusivity and diversity of our collections have not addressed the iniquity of documentation. Engagement between special collections and the teaching and learning community has typically been confined to the reading room. However, I hope I've offered some ideas of how those in public-facing roles within special collections libraries can leverage the reading room relationship and expand it to engage with community stakeholders at their point of need, to help ensure the continued relevance of special collections long into the future. I also hope that I've demonstrated why public services are an important component of any forward-thinking special collections strategy. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachael. And now you and I, unfortunately, have to go beyond the sphere of special collections to general collections, where it's not my home territory. We now have a triumvirate. Dan, stick up your hand. When Daniel Dollar was a Boy Scout, he chased a bear that had snitched his troop's bag of food. Since then, he has lent his fearlessness and leadership skills to the field of librarianship. He is the Associate University Librarian for Collections, Preservation, and Digital Scholarship at the Yale University Library. Daniel is involved in a range of collaborative initiatives with other academic research libraries, including Hattie Trust. He also represents the Yale University Library as a founding partner of Research for Life, a public-private partnership with United Nations agencies to reduce the knowledge gap between high-income countries and low- and middle-income countries by providing affordable access to scholarly, professional, and research information. Sarah Tudesco is a room-shaking organist and the program director for Assessment and User Experience Research at Yale University Library. She collaborates closely with colleagues at Yale and in the Ivy Plus libraries on initiatives designed to better understand the scope and impact of library collections. Jeff Kosokoff is an avid curler. But between sending granite stones down the ice, he is Assistant University Librarian for Collection Strategy at Duke University Libraries. Jeff provides leadership, vision, and strategic direction for the Duke University Libraries in the development, preservation, and management of libraries' general collections. Like Daniel, he is deeply engaged with library collections initiatives through the Ivy Plus Libraries Confederation, the Hattie Trust Digital Library, and the Center for Research Libraries. Together, they are going to talk about the collection is the network, collection collaboration and cooperation at network scale. Ladies and gentlemen, Dan, Jeff, and Sarah.
Thanks. I just want to say, instead of saying it again, +1 to all the thank yous that have been coming out. I'm humbled to be here, so thank you. I want to pick up on one thing Rachel said before I read this. We agree. Special collections people understand, and what we're going to talk about really is general collections should be the same for everybody on the planet. And getting there, it's going to take a huge village to do that. That's why the future is crowded, all of that. But it's not that any of us, and here's Yale saying it, right, think that we should be distinguished by general collections anymore, and we're hoping to get there. So I don't know if people noticed, but this great meeting coincided with Google's 20th birthday. While Google and Facebook and Amazon and Twitter and Hattie Trust are all markers of major transformations in the information landscape, I think it's important to keep in mind that the interwebs we experience today will look like incunabula a generation or two, or maybe less, from now. I think it's important not to plan for the future as though our networked library information landscape will look, feel, or work like it does today. Discovery will work better. The legal landscape will hopefully improve. Kevin. Resource sharing and other fulfillment systems for physical and digital materials will enable better services, and I think efficiency in libraries and all of that. I was struck last night by Don sharing that from where he sits, he sees much of our work as experiments. Field work, I think is the word he used. I'm glad to hear that because I think we need to think boldly and take risks. We need to keep in mind that in this rapidly changing landscape, we're just at the beginning. As a library community of practice, as a society, we're at the incunabula, where it comes to applying technology to how we identify, deliver, and use information. We have Keurig machines in the hotel next door. And if you want coffee, they're fine. but let's be fair, the coffee isn't any good. And I would say maybe we're one killer app away from the codex for ebooks, or a good coffee capsule machine. But right now what we have is much more like a scroll. So to paraphrase Mark Twain, the rumors of the death of the printed book are greatly exaggerated. Let's remember that from a library collection perspective, as in society at large, new media formats transform previous formats, but unlike what happened to the scroll, frequently do not obviate their predecessors. Certainly the role of newspapers changed when radio arrived. Newspapers and radio changed with the rise of broadcast television, on-demand technologies, and the web changed newspapers. And radio and television once again. And we still have broadsides. So let's bring this back to the book. Libraries support a bunch of use cases for printed books. And as we've heard this week, not all of those important users are our connoisseurs. I'm thinking of Jay's paper. for everybody, right? So it's key to remember that from a use and preservation perspective, digital and print are both super important, and they support different uses. They complement each other, no matter which version was born first. And we've created a symbiosis in this space, I think. A physical book can be made digital, a digital book can be made physical, and we can build and adapt our spaces to accommodate both. Daniel.
So I'll just riff on this photo for just a moment. I appreciate the earlier shout out to the Digital Humanities Lab at Yale under the leadership of Peter Leonard. This right here is our new Frankie Family Reading Room, Digital Humanities Laboratory. I have to get it all out. Anyway, in this space, which soft opening is next week, and we'll have a formal opening later in October. But you can see here a number of different things that are happening. Like over here, we have a digital humanities reference collection with the titles, the covers face out for browsing. I know browsing was mentioned. So there you go. But we have our staff here, the digital humanities staff students. Right here in front is Pam Patterson. She's one of our digital scholarship technologists. In the cubicle in here, there's someone with a high-speed Zoichel microfilm scanner, so we still got microfilm. Lord, we still have microfiche. So things are persisting. And then there's teaching and research going on. So, and an Oculus. Yeah, there is an Oculus. It's back in there somewhere. So yes, we got one. But we don't have like the whole lab thing. So go Oklahoma. So anyway, so switching to a slide here, it's important to note again that we are talking about general collections. The future in a nutshell, so network scale collaboration of library collections is the most complete library. Discovery linked to improved resource sharing will be more universal and available to all libraries. Systems that mash up metadata and objects from multiple sources will be working together to aggregate content discovery and availability in ways that we can barely see in today's environment. The distance will matter less, and in general, access to greater collections will not be reserved to anyone in particular. Like the present, just a lot more efficient to operate, much more user-friendly, and let's hope and work at this much less privileged. Here is a visualization of an important aspect of this emerging and already present network. This chart was created by Lavoie, Malpas, and Shippengrove over at OCLC. And what it does is it maps print book resources in North American mega urban regions. So here in Philadelphia, we are located in the largest region, beautifully named Oswash. I'd rather live in Charlanta, but anyway, that's just me. I know, that's all right. Well, no, when I got my job at Yale, my mom, who we grew up in North Carolina, she said, well, that's nice, son, but it's not Duke. And I was like, yeah. All right. Keep me humble. Thank you. All right. But what's not shown in this particular visualization, so you can see there's millions of volumes all across the country that are held in library collections. What is not shown in this particular visualization is the uniqueness. And everywhere, all across the country, Canada, and obviously globally, there's unique holdings. So just being in the biggest circle is not good enough. We need to link these together and work together. And as Don Waters mentioned last night, space is a salient, very pressing issue for us. So if we let our legacy collections get weeded or used out of existence, they can perhaps never be recovered. Digitization, cooperative print retention, collective development based on librarian and library community engagement across geographical barriers, robust description and organization, and improved storage environments all mitigate against the loss of our cultural heritage. I have this little clock here, and it was at 10 minutes. It's just been there. Now all of a sudden it's 5. It's like the future. We can travel through time, just manipulate it. So anyway, so as our public library colleagues pointed out yesterday, that effective partnerships that will undergird healthy networks must be based on shared goals and outcomes with signed MOUs. This cannot be sustained on the basis of goodwill and handshakes. We have shared goals, outcomes, and an MOU with the Ivy Plus libraries, where we've embraced a vision of a shared 90 million volume collection, our collective collection. And I again appreciate the earlier mentions today of HathiTrust, the HathiTrust Library, where libraries have come together under a shared MOU with shared goals and outcomes and building, yes, off of the Google Books project, but to create the largest digital corpus of textual materials stewarded by a nonprofit entity. And if we're talking about anniversaries, this is the 10th anniversary of HathiTrust. So just think about what's been done in the space of a decade. It's really amazing. So collections are a service. Yeah, they're data, but they're a service for use in support of teaching, research, and the public. Such an approach must place emphasis on connecting communities through outreach and narratives, as also been discussed at this conference, so that those individuals can actually connect to these materials. And we've talked a lot about inequality, and so if we're going to close the knowledge gaps that exist, we're going to have to work together and not be isolated in Ivy Towers or other institutions. How do we come together to close these gaps? Thank you. And I'll now turn it over to Sarah.
At my institution, I worked to understand how our communities of undergraduates, graduate students, scholars, researchers, and faculty engage with the library. How do they connect and respond to our services? What do they think of, and how do they use the digital systems we deploy to connect them to physical collections that we store in a variety of spaces that range from open stacks to remote warehouses? What do they think of the systems we use to deploy to connect them to the digital content we license and to the born digital content we work to preserve, as well as the digital surrogates we create to facilitate access to manuscripts and rare books? How do they use our spaces, from traditional reading rooms to new laboratories? These are all spaces that are designed to facilitate engagement with collections, but in different contexts. In our conversation around the networkization of our research collections, what I see in our data, both quantitative and qualitative, is that the network collection ideas are taking hold in our ecosystem. That they have taken hold in spite of the clunkiness of the interfaces we've deployed over the years is a powerful metric. Right now, nearly 25% of the activity around our traditional physical research collections involve the network at Yale University. Could anybody have predicted that 20 years ago? I believe the network has the potential to enable our institutions to deploy our resources, our money, and our human capital in areas that will ensure that libraries can continue to facilitate the connection between content and communities. I want to riff a little bit about the conclusion of Dr. Matthews' paper from 2 days ago. The academic library has remained the backbone and heart of the American higher education institution. This era of adapting to increasing scale and scope of American higher education certainly laid the foundation for the mega libraries of the mid-20th century and the digital revolution of the 21st century. Through each era of our change over, the academic library remains steadfast, yet flexible, foundation of American higher education. I want to take this a bit further. When something is flexible, it has the ability to bend without breaking. I think a better word might be versatile. A versatile system has the ability to adapt. Libraries have the potential, through their versatility, to facilitate the connections between content and communities for future generations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, all three of you, for that splendid presentation. Phil Schreur is currently the Associate Librarian for Technical and Access Services at Stanford University. He's also a pug breeder. And his Bug Buster won the national competition in 2012. Congratulations to Phil. He has been the chair of the program for cooperative cataloging and deeply involved in the implementation of the new cataloging rules, Resource Description and Access, RDA, in the United States. With a mid-career move to high-wire press, he developed an interest in the automated taxonomic analysis of digital texts. And currently he is in charge of coordinating linked data project development for the Stanford University libraries. And today he's going to speak on library metadata as linked data, transition, transformation, and accountability. Phil, thank you very much.
So thank you very much. Boy, last day, last session, last speaker, the pressure is on. So the first thing you'll probably notice is that I've changed the title of my talk. So I don't know if anybody recognizes what these are, but I have to admit, when I thought about the future of libraries, even just 3 to 5 years in the future, these formulae were the very first things that came to mind. Well, maybe not the very first thing, but it was a close second. It's often very difficult to think about the future without being fixated on the present, that turbulent intersection between the past and the future. The set of formulae on the screen helps scientists to predict, to understand that unpredictable area of intersection and change through the use of Reynolds decomposition, and can help them predict how these areas will react to each other through time-dependent variation and other flow properties. Perhaps a better analogy are turbulent boundary layers, those intersections of fresh and salt water where the ocean meets the land. The currents created there can be amazingly difficult to predict, tantalizingly familiar at a high level, but quite unpredictable locally. As I look ahead at trends in technical services, especially metadata, I find similar unpredictability. We have been told for many years that print will give way to electronic, but our print acquisitions are still going strong. Second, MARC's demise has been predicted long ago, as was noted yesterday, even if it's, to quote Sally McCallum, through obesity. And yet we are as dependent on it as we were in the 1960s. And last, there has been an increasing exposure of privilege and exclusivity in information access and discovery, and yet traditional approaches to resource description, such as the use of the Library of Congress subject headings, still dominate our information ecosphere. To better understand what our future may be, we must access deeper currents, those irresistible drivers of what will ultimately shape our landscape. The trick is, of course, to choose the right set of currents for your particular area. So in the area of technical services, I've chosen 3 main drivers. First, the shift away from MARC to linked data. Next, globalization of our patrons and our expectations. And last, accountability of access. So first, just to take a quick look at MARC and linked data. And you can't talk about MARC without talking about the 1960s. So MARC was developed in the 1960s, a truly turbulent time in US history. There were social revolutions, primary colors, moon landings, and assassinations. MARC in its own way was part of that revolutionary time. It allowed us to move our bibliographic data away from card catalogs to a machine-readable form. There were tremendous advantages in communication and data sharing in this new format. And to truly understand the revolution that was MARC, you must look at a yet earlier technology from the 1950s, and that is the catalog card. Looking at this 1950s technology, it's clear why MARC was such an advantage. The semantics of the catalog card are expressed through physical placement on the card. The first line is the author, the second line is the title, etc. And if you ever wanted to modify the data, such as add the death date for Albert Camus, You often had to do it manually, in this case through a ballpoint pen. Consciously or subconsciously, this dependence on position for semantics crept into our thinking behind MARC. So even though the MARC formats allowed us to move our data into the computer age, all it really did was reconstruct the catalog card on the computer screen. It still requires a human being looking at the screen to understand the details of the data, how all those bits and pieces relate to each other. To a machine, this data is semantically inarticulate, and in a world dominated by the web, this is deadly. Libraries and technical services need to fully transition to the web as quickly as possible to embed themselves and their data there in as semantically rich a way as possible. But the shift to the web brings many benefits to other benefits to technical services as well. Libraries have reluctantly started to accept the fact that there is a wealth of information on the web in which our patrons are interested. By linking out to trusted sources of information, by bringing it into our own discovery environments, we can take advantage of a world of data that dwarfs our own. But there's also a more focused benefit. The Bibliothèque Nationale de France will catalog items published in France. The Deutsche Nationalbibliothek will catalog items published in German. And yet, we recatalog all those items for English language catalogs. We redo all the authority work. We recast the descriptive notes. We insist on the language of cataloging being English. By shifting our focus to the web, accepting the work of other national libraries, trusting international identifiers for common entities, we could save an inordinate amount of time spent locally recataloging all of these items so that we could focus our energies on unique, truly unique local resources. Of course, trust is hard to come by. In speaking about this concept with a library in Europe last summer, they said that they were extremely pleased that we would accept all of their identifiers they create for their national authors. But of course, they would never accept ours. That was going too far. So libraries have a long way to go as far as trust and acceptance of each other's work. The discussion as to whether libraries are or can be neutral is not a new one, but received additional attention because of the ALA President's program at last midwinter entitled, "Are Libraries Neutral? Have They Ever Been? Should They Be?" Library technical services were not explicitly brought up in this discussion, perhaps because of the seemingly arbitrary nature of the process, but we are far from exempt. It has been pointed out that certain values structure libraries in such a way that they come to embrace institutional oppression rather than resist it. As Brian Rosenblum has said in Decolonizing Libraries, cataloging is a method of knowledge control. The choice of what we catalog silences some voices from the scholarly record. The choice of order and fullness of cataloging privileges some materials over others. The very choice of terminology used to draw together data on a certain subject can be considered offensive to those forced to use it. Discovery, being built upon inherently privileged metadata, predetermines outcomes. So what possible alternatives do we have? AI, machine learning, and the web itself offer new opportunities to resolve many of our dilemmas. But of course, as Sophia Noble has clearly demonstrated in Algorithms of Oppression, these new tools must be used with great caution. They have clearly been used to reinforce privilege rather than to neutralize it. But let's assume for a moment that libraries could use AI and machine learning for the benefit of their patrons. Established technologies such as name entity recognition can be used to automatically extract names, places, and dates from digital text. Automated identifier creation and reconciliation can be used to harmonize that data. Growing tools for the automated assignment of subject terminology can allow us to create multiple pathways to discovery, no longer privileging just one. By developing tools to explore the graph of data around any particular topic, to follow the paths of multiple researchers, we free ourselves from tying discovery to laboriously created metadata surrogates for individual resources. So I'd like to leave you with 4 images posted on social media only a few months ago. So when I think of technical services, of metadata structure and creation, of discovery, I often think about these images. So here is the first one. And this is the second one. And this is the third one. And this is the fourth one. These are only a few of the millions of images that appeared on the web that day. What do we choose to capture? How do we choose to provide access? From whose perspective? Can there ever be a neutral presentation of these images? Do I highlight their political nature, their parodies of artistic styles and periods? Does the true benefit to scholars, how they wish to discover these images, derive more from how people are making use of them rather than from a privileged metadata surrogate that I might create? The world of discovery and access is in a time of impatient transformation. Control and privilege are breaking down by the sheer onslaught of information. How libraries choose to respond will either bind them tightly to this new, continually morphing data sphere or marginalize them to a secret garden formed by the semantics of catalog cards. So with that, thank you very much.
Thank you, Phil. We've had 3 truly excellent talks. Rachael discussed how special collections can stay relevant, and in her paper it has a marvelous last line. Value does not emerge from the rarity of our holdings, but from how successfully we collaborate and engage with members of our user communities. Dan, Jeff, and Sarah discussed the future of networking among large research libraries through increasingly networked technological, logistical, and physical infrastructures. And Jeff articulated how we are going to get our information freed from MARC and onto the linked data environment of the web. All 3 of these talks are from members of research libraries, and they portray a future that seems to me to be within reach. But concerning that, I loved a quote that Jeff wrote in his paper from William Gibson. "The future is here. It just isn't evenly distributed." As the director of a newly renovated Special Collections Center at the University of Pennsylvania Libraries, I can say that I'm in an environment that embraces much of that future. But as the curator of a manuscript collection in a museum in inner-city Baltimore, I certainly wasn't. The difference between my old job and my new one does make me conscious of the breadths of the networks that we have to make, collaborations that we have to undertake, and the communities that we have to serve as a profession. The biggest problem we face as a society is the ever-increasing difference between the haves and the have-nots. This difference is reflected in the audiences that we serve. The University of Pennsylvania Library's mission is to support the faculty and students of the university. The Free Library mission is to serve an audience that is more than 50% functionally illiterate. I think that the major research libraries need to redefine their mission if they're going to pay more than lip service to the idea that they should engage a public wider than those that exist on campuses. And now under the leadership of Constantia Constantinou, Director of Penn Libraries will do just that. The benefits of collaboration between research libraries and independent and public libraries seem to me to be the most exciting opportunities in our profession. But there is a long way to go for all of us, and it is no coincidence that the roundtables yesterday were devoted separately to the academic, public, and independent libraries. Of course, one of the places where we can all meet and need to meet is on the web, and this is exactly what Philip Schreur's paper addressed. How to get our information out there by getting our finely curated, excellent information truly there to spar with both the good and the fake on the internet. The major research libraries have great collections and are proud of them, as are the independent libraries. But so do many major public libraries, most notably the Free Library here in Philadelphia. But I think that all libraries need to understand the importance of something that Rachael wrote. She writes, "Unhitching ownership from access and description opens the door to collaborative collecting with new and diverse donors." This is so spot on. Open access is normally understood to benefit users, and indeed it does. But on a structural level, what it also does is enable collaboration between institutions, and especially those with unequal resources. If a small library with special collections can have their collection digitized and hosted by a larger institution, while maintaining as much control over that information as the host, then they're much more likely to collaborate. To do this, we need to not only license our information openly, but also to technically expose the digital stacks of our libraries, releasing full resolution images and technical and structural metadata, as well as descriptive. And then I think the beautiful future that Ben and Jeff and Sarah paint can be yet more broadly shared, not just because more users will have access to it, but also because smaller libraries can collaborate with bigger ones without losing their control and their identity. Before I began working in an academic research library, I was a curator in a museum in downtown Baltimore. People actually came to my exhibitions. Generally speaking, people don't come to exhibitions in special collections libraries unless they donated the exhibited collection or came to a symposium intellectually aligned with the exhibition, or because they curated the exhibition, or because their professor told the student that he or she should go to the exhibition. And this is not surprising. Many of us do not advertise our exhibitions as museums do, and many of us are closed after working hours and at the weekends. To rectify this, of course, we have to change our mission, but we have to change a great deal more. And exhibitions are just the point of the spear. To build community, we have to not only open our physical doors, but also tear down our metaphorical walls. And to host our publics, we have to change our hours of operation. I do think that when it comes to engaging communities, museums are often ahead of libraries. And I think now we can learn from the of, by, for all movement, spearheaded by Nina Simon, director of the Santa Cruz Museum of Art and History. We don't just need to think of our role as providing information for our communities. As institutions, we also need to be by our community and of our community. As Don Waters said yesterday, this means diversifying our staff and diversifying our collections. For research libraries, this might mean blurring the distinctions between librarians and professors and students, and it also might mean putting a real emphasis on collecting the information produced by our faculty and students. Before I open the floor to questions, I do want to give a shout out to PAC School, the Philadelphia Area Consortium of Special Collections Libraries. It embraces research libraries, independent libraries, and public libraries. It facilitates collaborations that shape the cultural life of the city of Philadelphia, and it attracts the funding of both the NEH and the Mellon Foundation through CLEAR and the IMLS, as well as many other important grant-giving bodies. And without the support of these organizations and these funding operations, every library in Philadelphia would be far less networked and far less collaborative, and their communities we would not be serving nearly so well. Finally, I want to give a shout out to the superstar of this organization, an independent librarian, Laura Blanchard, the sine qua non of PAC School, who, to the horror of nearly every librarian in Philadelphia, is contemplating retirement. Thank you, Laura, there at the back, for all you have done to promote networks, collaborations, and communities in Philadelphia. No library is an island entire of itself. Many libraries are in trouble, and anyone's death diminishes us all. We sink or swim together, and so does our society. No one of us should have to ask for whom the bells toll. Thank you.
Questions? I think there's one in the back.
I have a question about the increase of public access and public services for special collections. And you talked fantastically about sort of expanding skill sets and roles with new emerging technologies. And I wondered if you could speak about the difficulties therein where people managing digital technologies in special collections libraries are often in a separate department from public services, and how those invisible departmental walls, can be really strong, and any sort of ideas you have about working around that when people in charge of digital collections and digital scholarship in that library maybe don't even talk to the public services people.
Is this already on? It is, okay, awesome. Thank you for your question. As I brainstorm sort of some of the examples that we've used in our own institution, I think it is an issue. I think you've identified one of the tensions. How do you provide access to something that you're not, you don't have readily accessible? You have to go through these other platforms. You have to ask another department to give you the files. I don't know if I have solutions. I think that it is a challenge that we certainly have encountered, and I've encountered at previous institutions as well. I think that as we look to the discovery systems that we're using and implementing, I think a good question would be, can anybody in my library or any user access this without me having to act as that that gatekeeper, that person who's providing access? Because I think that's a real barrier, right? If that person's not there that day, or you have to wait to speak with somebody, they're out of their office. I think that can be a really big barrier to access. I would love to know if you've come up with any solutions that you'd be willing to share as well.
Yeah, I mean, I would say I don't. But I do get tons of emails from public services asking if I can give them access to a single image file, and it is continuously a question for me of why I'm not allowed to just give them the access so they can get their own image. And I think that, I guess I was just wondering from the more public services angle if there's that kind of collaborative thought, because it makes zero sense. I would hate if I had to go ask them to have physical access to a book from our stacks, which I definitely don't. But it's just an ongoing problem as public services gets more and more involved, and more requests coming into public services are about access to digital surrogates or access to data that they can only say. I think it's very disempowering.
I think others have maybe alluded to this as well, but full high-resolution images that you can download on demand, I think would be great. I know we don't typically do that, but I think that would be one way to make it easier on all of us.
I would just add in that at Yale we did a reorganization. We brought together a stat lab and our digital humanities lab and created the Digital Scholarship Services Department. And we're still working, developing, and building that out. One of the things that we're trying to address is making the library more transparent in terms of, I have a question, it's involved in some, it's GIS or it's text and data mining. They don't know where to go, and they end up shopping around even within the university as a whole. So we're trying to make things simpler within our organization for those kind of questions, and then to make the handoffs, we can take care of that in the background. We're rolling out a CRM system to sort of help with sort of the management of some of that. But then internally, I think there's just a lot of conversations that need to continue to happen between the director of our digital scholarship department and our library IT, and I see Jay Rossman out there with our humanities and area studies librarians. How can we build the networks and then figure out the procedures so that this can happen more smoothly? But it's amazing to think about all of the challenges we have just to make things work within our individual organizations, and then of course we need to move beyond that. How do we work collaboratively across institutions? So there's some real challenges.
I guess just the one small thing I would add. So I certainly hear the issue of trying to access, especially digital images. So we've tried in our catalog You're very limited as to what you can actually display. There's a certain number of pixels that legally you can display within the catalog, but we've tried whenever possible, if you click on that image, if it is available to you, that the rights come along with it and you're able to download the image at the same time from the digital repository, to just try to get out of that needing to ask somebody for permission to get the image all the time.
Another one back here.
This is just a comment to your question, sort of one potential way to kind of chip away at this. In my previous position at NYU Libraries, we were involving both public service and folks outside of the digital library group in software development projects as product owners in agile processes. And I think this is something that also speaks to some earlier comments about diversity of voices in technological projects, thinking about who in your organization can play what role in technological development, where you have important knowledge and skills that can contribute to software development or service development processes. It's something I think the archive space community has also been thinking about, how to involve a wide variety of archivists in open source software development. I think folks who say, you know, I'm not a developer, I can't code, I don't know how to be a part of this, actually do have very important skills and abilities to bring to those processes. So I would encourage that kind of thinking, bringing that kind of thinking to this.
This is just going to be a comment, and I'll make it as brief as possible. Much talk about collaboration across larger and smaller institutions, and much talk about reaching out to broader communities. In the city of Philadelphia, where we have something like 190,000 school children, a very large number of them on free lunch programs and coming out of neighborhoods which are very troubled, I would like everybody who is working from these institutions where technological apparatus is easy to come by and technological expertise is fairly easy to come by. If you're serious about working in a city like Philadelphia, many cities in a lot of respects are like Philadelphia, I think your work is going to have to be informed by a lot of conversation with the people that you actually talk about reaching. We have a lot of folks in this city, no matter what you're pushing out, who don't have access to the kind of machinery, computers just for example, or the internet, which would permit them to receive what you're offering. So I would hope that the conversations themselves include teachers, parents from the communities in which you want to serve, and not simply all of us who are quite comfortable with these techniques and these pieces of apparatus, because otherwise you will be in a position where you can talk about your output, but you won't really have much grasp on your outcomes and how much your messages, all well-intentioned and potentially transformative for a city like Philadelphia, are actually reaching the destination you'd like them to reach.
Hi, Lindsay Van Tyne. I have a question for Phil, and I'm interested in hearing more about linked open data from the perspective of special collections in particular, and collections as data. So I'm with you on MARC being, you know, often frustrating, very idiosyncratic, not as automatically machine readable as we would like it to be. But at the same time, I think special collections MARC, rare book cataloging, is often a very rich source of copy-specific information. And that's just a drop in the bucket when thinking about, you know, library collections as a whole. But within the special collections community, I think there is a lot of desire to retain the richness and copy-specific nature of that information. And there's been recent discussion of the inadequacy of WorldCat, to do that, to have a framework for thinking about copy-specific information across collections. The other thing I would say, you showed a catalog card with, ballpoint pen notes as an example kind of the clumsiness of MARC. But I think that's also a reminder that, every time we remediate, there's something lost. And I think there's a reason that in a lot of special collections, we keep those card catalogs, and we still refer to them. And I think it's inevitable, I've been having these conversations recently, that with the move to linked open data, especially from special collections MARC, a lot will be lost. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts on, well, and I think also just on that note, within special collections, the leap to linked open data is more difficult. The schema is less in place, so it's not quite here yet. But at the same time, there is a need to break out of the silos to come up with something more like WorldCat that could take this copy-specific data and kind of make it more interoperable. So I'm curious to hear how you would think about balancing that need for keeping the existing richness of cataloging information, but trying to link it out to other sources, and whether there's a plan, kind of a preservation plan, a backup plan for preserving that legacy MARC somewhere when we move away from it.
So, I thought of three things. I hope I remember all three. So the first one is to talk about the ontology that is being used to record library metadata as linked data is something called BibFrame, which has been developed by the Library of Congress. There has been a group working with RBMS to provide an extension to BibFrame, especially for rare materials. So that ontology is just about finished, but again, the big focus is on recording copy-specific notes to make sure that information is not lost, because it is very true in the linked data structures we have right now, those things can be lost. So that ontology is available now, or will be within a couple of months. And as part of the project, another project that we have started, funded by the Mellon Foundation, there will be maybe 5 or 6 libraries. I think it's Minnesota and the Frick and Austin, all working together on rare materials to put it into linked data to see how it'll work. So I think that will help with the printed materials. Thinking about one of the other things somebody brought up is the difficulty of accessing things that are in folders. So one thing I have to admit, linked data is really bad about hierarchy. It does not do that type of structure at all very well. But one of the things I am encouraged about is if the material in those individual folders can be digitized by automatically extracting names and doing that reconciliation, you can sort of bypass the whole hierarchy folder business and go immediately to the document that you're looking for. So I think that is going to be, that will be a big asset. And then I have forgotten the third thing. So, preservation of MARC. So what I think about that is one thing that is really the catalogers are talking about is that we don't want to ever lose any note or any information. So I kind of think, and in linked data, you never delete anything, you just add a new statement. So I think about it kind of like the Internet Wayback Machine. You should have this developing levels of data, and you should be able to roll it back to get back to whatever it is somebody had said at some earlier point, just so that you do not lose any of that sort of historic data for whatever reason could have been very important at the time, or just to see the chronology of metadata as it develops over time.
Okay. We have reached the end of the future. But we haven't reached the end of proceedings. So if you could stay in your seats while you give a round of applause to our panelists, that would be fantastic. the end of the proceedings is going to be our host, Pat Sparrow. A round of applause, please.
Thank you, Will, and thank you all again. For the wrap-up, we've invited Deanna Markham to come back up and share some of her thoughts on the last 2.5 days, and also then, of course, to open it up to everybody else to share your thoughts, your comments, your questions. And at 12:30 or around 12:30, we'll end, and there is lunch provided in the foyer for everybody that's here. All right, Deanna, thank you for coming up. You can have this microphone.
Thank you.
Great. So. Oh. So I just have a few general questions before turning it over to the group. But before that, I wanted to do one last round of thanks for everybody that made this conference happen. I want to thank the Schoenrock family, Jeremy, Todd, and Christina, who have been working behind the scenes to make sure that the AV and the webcast has worked, and it's worked marvelously this entire weekend. So I think they deserve a loud round of applause. And at the break, Christina let us know that over 5,600 people have been tuning in online over the past 2.5 days, which is a remarkable number. So thank you out there, and thank you everybody here. I think we owe ourselves a round of applause for the last 2.5 days. And Donna Stum is in the back, and she's been making sure that all of the logistics of the conference has happened. So thank you, Donna. And Jessica Frankenfield, who's our social media coordinator, has been handling our Twitter handle and also helping everybody get their questions asked and serving in a variety of different ways throughout the weekend. So thank you, Jess. And Brenna Holland, who I think can't join us at this moment, although I know she wishes she could, is out in the front, but she has been also working on all the logistical matters. So a round of applause for her, I think, is... And last, but certainly not least, in fact, last precisely because not least, is Adriana Link, the head of scholarly programs, who has been spearheading absolutely everything, coordinating all the details. She's been saying throughout, as the conference approached, we have these meetings, and she said, this feels like a mini meeting. And I think we can all say there's nothing mini about the meeting that we just had. So, Adriana. Now, looking backwards, now that we've gone to the future, on the past 2.5 days, Deanna, I was wondering if you could talk about some of the key themes that you think connected all of these panels.
Great. I have been so privileged to be here. This has been a great opportunity. I said to Patrick earlier this morning, I was trying to remember when I was last in a room with public librarians, independent research librarians, and research librarians, and I couldn't think of another time. This is a remarkable conference. And the themes that have connected all of us, I think, our great interest in getting the knowledge that's contained in our collections out to the appropriate communities and out to communities we don't even know about yet. And trying to find a way to do that is so important to every group in the room, and it seemed to me that there were some wonderful opportunities for collaboration here. Having the public librarians talk about what they are doing to help with literacy and numeracy and just the general welfare of people. Then the independent research libraries and the research libraries trying to figure out how to make their collections more usable by developing tools that are appropriate for many different kinds of users. I just think the opportunities for collaboration are staggering. So I've been really excited to think about all the things that can be done as a result of the conversations we've had here.
Great. And one of the things I wanted to ask you about are the missed opportunities, and one of them came to mind or things that were absent from our discussions. And one of them came to mind in the last session when I saw the slide that Daniel Dollar showed about the collections everywhere. And we've had public librarians, we've had research librarians, independent research libraries represented here. We haven't had the Library of Congress at all a part of this conversation. So where does that fit into all of this?
I was thinking about that myself. I thought, why didn't somebody from the Library of Congress show up here today? They should have. One of the, it's a broader question, and you talked about what's missing. We didn't talk about organizational structures very much. And when you think about how libraries of all types are organized and how they are often trying to meet a particular purpose and begin thinking about themselves in a very particular way, and I think that is something that has happened to the Library of Congress, being much more focused on meeting the needs of Congress. If you read the material that's on the web now from the Library of Congress, there's a greater emphasis on serving the needs of Congress. There used to be
they
much
probably need more help.
Yeah, much more. I mean, if I thought it would help, that would be fine. But I guess that was not quite politically correct. But they're all libraries, the Library of Congress in particular, but all libraries need to think more about how they connect to other libraries and what they can do together. And when I said what's missing is organizational structures, when you think about how we have been organized and how so much of what we do is focused on our reputation more than what we accomplish, it inhibits collaboration. And so I'm really anxious to see more of that. And the Library of Congress has been so focused on trying to make sure that people see it as relevant and important to the American people. They are doing many things that are, outreach kinds of activities, but they're not with other libraries. And so we need to find a way to build those bridges, make those connections.
Anything else you wished we'd talk more about?
Lots of things, but I won't go away. I just hope this conversation continues. I think we talked about a lot of possibilities. Now let's figure out how to make some of those real.
Yeah, great. I just have a couple more before opening it up. And speaking about organizational structures in libraries, you've been at a variety of different roles throughout your career. When you think about good library leadership, what makes for good library leadership?
Good library leadership is a combination, I think, of knowledge, deep knowledge, both of the subject you're working in and your community. It's a vision, where we need to go. And the third piece, which is the part that's most often missing, is the ability to connect what's going on right now to that vision. And a willingness to do the yucky work that goes along with making that happen. A good library leader is one who will figure out the budget and the financial picture and business models and HR stuff, and doing that in the background while helping people realize the vision. And it's also a great desire to want to do all of those things.
Yeah, great. And what advice would you give to those that may not be in a position of leadership now but aspire to be there? What should they be thinking about in their jobs, in their career, and how can they even affect change that they want to have happen, even if they're not in a decision-making position?
Yeah, at this stage in my career, I talk to a lot of younger people who want to be leaders, and I always encourage them to do two things. One, be very clear about what you actually want to do. Do what you love, and find a way to make what you love fit your professional life. Secondly, find a mentor. Work with someone else who has, and realize that the world of your mentor is not your world. You have the world. The young librarians have the world right now. We old ones can simply help you avoid the landmines. That's all we can do now. As we watch you create this new vision, and it's been so inspiring to see all of you. I mean, I don't worry at all about the next generation of leadership. You're ready. You're ready. But I think what we can do, we older ones, is recognize that it is your world, but we can help with things like, how do you deal with political problems? How do you deal with interpersonal relationships? How do you get your fellow department members to give you access to the things you need to do your work? We can help with that, because that's what we have done in the past.
Great. I have a list of more questions I'd love to ask you, but I'm sure everybody in the audience has questions as well. So while the mics get ready, I'll ask one last one. Looking back over the last, say, 30 years, I was so interested in hearing you and Don talk about this history of digital libraries and ideas that preceded anything I know or knew. If you could have changed one thing going back into the 80s or 90s that libraries could have collectively done differently, what would it have been?
That's a really interesting question. I mean, I have a whole list of failures that I would redo, but if I could redo one thing that I did in my career, I was telling this to Brian Schottlander earlier today. I think the biggest failure in my career is that I did not insist that the Digital Library Federation, when it was formed, be open to everyone. I inherited a group and I worked with it. I should have done more to make that inclusive, because when it was a limited group, we spent far too much time talking about why other people weren't included, and that was a waste of time. We could have advanced the digital library movement if we had worked with that in a more constructive way.
Oh, great, thanks.
Hi. I am struck by conversations from this morning and throughout these several days about community inclusivity in so many ways. And something I was thinking about from earlier this morning as we were talking about, really avant-garde technical things and how do we listen. And I'm going to take advantage of having you up there and what you just mentioned about mentoring and how do we engage and take advantage of empathy? Do we have the resources for these kinds of things? And how do we give ourselves that time and the space in our conversations when we're so pressured to do all these wonderful things and we're energized to do those wonderful things? How do we give ourselves those resources to listen and make sure that we're reaching the correct audiences now and into the future? Thank you.
The one thing that is non-negotiable, we have 24 hours in every day, and there is no bargain we can make to get more time. And if you realize that every decision you make about time is a decision you are making, the answer is simple. You make the time. And you just have to figure out what's really important. And just because everybody else is running around like a crazy person doesn't actually mean you have to. It's a choice.
This is almost a comment and instead of a question, but I'm just wondering, well, actually, maybe I'm asking everyone here, is there a similar issue with education for library service as was mentioned in yesterday's panel about the public libraries, that our staff is not being prepared for the kind of work that they'll do in the communities? And in a public library, those communities, they're life and death issues, and they are, it gets very, it takes us out of the normal library practice, administering Narcan or trying to find somebody a shelter for the night. So, but as I hear the desires on everyone's part here to reach out into the community more, I'm thinking that there may be a track of library school education that helps us to do that and helps us to develop those skills among our new up-and-coming librarians.
One of the things that I would say about that is a really important realization in this conference is how hard it is to describe what the profession is all about now. And just in thinking about the panelists we've heard from, we've heard from a lot of people with different backgrounds, some with library and information science training, many not. And the success of our library programs is dependent upon many different kinds of skills. And as someone who's been working on reforming library education since the I started in 1980, on that particular project, I don't think it's productive to try to reform library education. I think it's more productive to think very broadly about the skills and talents we need from many different sectors and begin to figure out how to work more productively with all of those. I think that's the work we can do.
So I've got one last question. It may not be the right question to end a conference like this on, because we've heard about all the energy and excitement that is in libraries, all the things that people are doing and want to do. There hasn't been much about threats or dangers to libraries. And so I was wondering if you could talk about any existential threats or any real threats that you see libraries that they face today that may shape their future.
What I say is likely to be controversial, but you know, a lot of people think about libraries as collections, and we're thinking a lot about services. And I think it is a worry that we don't have an ongoing concern about building collections and thinking about the role society expects us to play as stewards of collections. So the threat is, you know, unless we figure out what our fundamental roles are and protect those, we risk losing identity. And I think that is my biggest concern.
Well, Thank you, Deanna, and thank you all.
You.